Imagine waking up in Britain more than 2,000 years ago. There are no roads, no towns built of stone, no markets selling imported luxuries, no Roman soldiers marching across the countryside. Instead, you step out of a circular wooden house into a landscape of fields, grazing cattle and distant hill forts. Smoke rises from hearth fires. Pigs root through woodland. Sheep graze on the hillsides. And breakfast? It probably wasn't very different from what your family had eaten for generations. Long before the Romans arrived in AD 43, the tribes of Britain had developed a sophisticated agricultural society. They farmed crops, raised livestock, hunted occasionally, gathered wild foods, brewed drinks, and held enormous feasts that helped bind entire communities together. In many ways, food sat at the very center of life. Before we get going, I would really appreciate if you liked and subscribed. Your support would allow me to create more videos like this in the future. Thank you. Here we go. This is what the ancient Britons ate. Life revolved around farming. The first thing to understand is that Iron Age Britons were not primarily hunters. Hollywood often portrays ancient tribes as living off wild game, but archaeology paints a different picture. By the centuries immediately before the Roman invasion, most Britons were farmers. Agriculture supplied the overwhelming majority of their food. Hunting still existed, but it played a much smaller role than raising animals and growing crops. Almost every settlement was surrounded by fields and grazing land. The average family lived largely self-sufficiently. They grew crops, they raised livestock, they stored food for winter, and they relied heavily on the seasonal rhythm of the year. A failed harvest could mean hardship. A successful harvest could mean abundance. The real kings of the British table: cattle. If there was one animal that defined wealth in pre-Roman Britain, it was the cow. Cattle were enormously valuable. They provided meat, milk, hides for leather, bones for tools, and even labor for pulling plows and carts. Owning large herds was a visible sign of status and power. Some historians believe cattle were among the most important measures of wealth in many Brittonic societies. Although beef was eaten, cattle were often too valuable to slaughter casually. Many animals would spend years producing milk, breeding, or working before eventually ending up on the table. When a cow was finally butchered, very little went to waste. The meat was eaten fresh, dried, or preserved. The hide became leather. Bones became tools. Even the horns could be worked into drinking vessels and craft items. Pork, the luxury meat. If beef represented wealth, pork may have been the favorite meat. Archaeological evidence shows pigs were extremely important in Iron Age Britain. Unlike cattle, pigs matured quickly and converted food into meat efficiently. Woodlands provided ideal conditions. Pigs could roam beneath oak trees and feed on fallen acorns, roots, nuts, and other natural foods. During major feasts, pigs often seem to have taken center stage. Large prehistoric feasting sites have revealed huge quantities of pig bones, suggesting pork was closely associated with communal celebrations and gatherings. For an ordinary Briton, pork was likely one of the most desirable meats available. Sheep, Britain's walking utility. Sheep provided much more than food. Their wool was essential for clothing. Their milk could be consumed or processed. Eventually, they could be slaughtered for meat. Because wool production was so important, many sheep would have lived considerably longer than animals raised purely for meat. In a world without synthetic fabrics, sheep were effectively walking clothing factories. Entire communities depended on them. Did Britons hunt? Yes, but not nearly as much as many people imagine. Wild deer, boar, hares, birds, and smaller animals were certainly hunted. However, archaeological evidence suggests wild game formed only a relatively small part of most people's diets. Why spend days chasing deer through forests when livestock was already grazing nearby? Hunting was often more about prestige, skill, and supplementing food supplies than everyday survival. Among tribal elites, hunting may also have served as a demonstration of courage and status. Specialized hunters almost certainly existed, particularly within larger tribal communities. Hunting dogs were highly regarded, and Britain became famous, even in antiquity, for producing excellent hunting dogs. A skilled hunter, equipped with spears, trained dogs, and local knowledge, could provide venison and other prized game for important feasts. Sacred animals and strange food taboos. One of the most fascinating aspects of Iron Age Britain concerns animals that may have been treated differently from ordinary livestock. Ancient writers and modern archaeology suggest that some animals held religious significance. Recent archaeological discoveries indicate that chickens and brown hares may initially have been regarded as special or sacred creatures rather than food. Researchers have found carefully buried remains showing little evidence of butchery, suggesting they may have been associated with ritual practices and deities. This creates a surprising image. While pigs and cattle were being slaughtered and roasted in great numbers, certain animals may have occupied an entirely different category, part food source, part religious symbol. Birds likely carried symbolic significance as messengers between worlds. Although details are difficult to reconstruct because Iron Age Britain has left few written records, archaeology strongly suggests that animals often held spiritual importance beyond their practical value. Growing their own food meat was important, but most daily calories came from crops. Britain's cultivated cereals such as wheat and barley. Grain was one of the foundations of life. Stored grain could survive through winter and feed entire communities. It could be ground into flour, cooked into porridge, baked into simple breads, or fermented into beer-like drinks. Small fields surrounded many settlements, creating a patchwork landscape that would have looked surprisingly familiar to modern eyes. Beans and peas were also grown. These provided valuable protein when meat was scarce. A family that could maintain grain stores and healthy livestock stood a good chance of surviving difficult seasons. Wild fruits, nuts, and seasonal foods. Ancient Britons did not enjoy strawberries in December. Food was seasonal, and people knew exactly when nature would provide. Throughout summer and autumn, they gathered native fruits including wild apples, blackberries, raspberries, sloes, elderberries, crab apples, hazelnuts were particularly important. They were nutritious, easy to store, and naturally abundant across Britain. In autumn, woodland became a giant pantry. Families collected nuts, berries, and fruits for immediate consumption and winter storage. Honey was another prized food. Without imported sugar, sweetness was rare. Honey served as both a luxury food and a valuable ingredient for fermented drinks. How did they cook? Almost every meal revolved around the hearth. The center of a roundhouse was usually occupied by a fire that burned throughout much of the year. Food could be roasted over flames, cooked in clay vessels, boiled in cauldrons, slow cooked in pits, smoked for preservation. Large joints of meat could be roasted directly above fires. Stews were common because they allowed tough cuts of meat, grains, vegetables, and herbs to cook slowly together. A stew could feed an entire family. It was efficient, nutritious, and ideal for a farming society. Smokehouses and drying methods helped preserve food for winter months when fresh supplies became limited. Feast days, most days, involved fairly ordinary meals, but feast days were something else entirely. Archaeological evidence reveals enormous communal gatherings where huge quantities of cattle, pigs, and sheep were consumed. These feasts weren't simply about eating, they reinforced alliances, displayed wealth, settled disputes, celebrated religious events, and strengthened tribal identity. Imagine hundreds of people gathering around fires while entire animals roasted over open flames, the smell of wood smoke, the sound of music, storytelling, drinking, negotiations between tribal leaders. Food was political. Food was religious. Food was social. In short, the ancient Britain diet centered on red meat, pork, dairy products, grains such as barley and wheat, beans, peas, eggs, seasonal vegetables, wild fruits, nuts, and honey. In coastal regions, fish, shellfish, mussels, oysters, and other seafood could also provide an important source of food, while rivers supplied freshwater fish to some inland communities. Hunting played a big role. but farming and livestock were the true foundation of everyday life. Their way of eating is even regarded today as one of the most balanced and healthiest diets. Their tables reflected not only survival, but status, spirituality, trade, and community. The ancient Britons built a rich culinary world, rooted in cattle-filled pastures, oak woodland, smoky hearth fires, and the rhythms of the British seasons. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share. This is my first ever video, and I would massively appreciate your support. You subscribing would help me out big time as I look to create more content like this in the near future.